She raised her hand one more time, and this time someone stopped it. Not a bodyguard, not a lawyer, not one of the powerful, polished people who move through that mansion every day like they belonged to it. It was the new maid, the woman who had only been working there for 5 days, the woman nobody had bothered to learn the name of yet. She crossed the room, wrapped her hand around that raised wrist and held it still in the air. She did not shout, she did not beg. She only said, "Not again." 2 words, delivered with the quiet certainty of someone who had already decided what they were going to do before they moved. The room went completely still. The elderly woman seated near the window looked up. She was trembling. But the strangest thing, the thing that stayed with everyone who was in that room, was that she did not look relieved. She looked afraid, more afraid than she had before the doors opened. And the person she was looking at was not the woman who had just raised her hand against her. She was looking at the man standing in the doorway. Min-ho Kang had come home early. He stood in the frame of those double doors and took in everything in front of him. His face did not change loudly. It never did. That was the thing about Minho that most people misunderstood when they first encountered him. He was not sharp-featured or theatrical. His face was slightly chubby, almost gentle at first glance, the kind of face that made people underestimate the mind behind it. His eyes were dark and calm and carried a silence that had made far more powerful men sit straighter across negotiating tables. He wore a dark-tailored suit, spoke softly when he spoke at all, and had long understood that softness in his hands was more dangerous than any display of anger. He stood in the doorway. He saw the wrist held in the air. He saw his mother shaking. And something behind his eyes shifted in a way that no one in that room had seen before. Before we go any deeper into this story, tell us where you are watching from. And if you already feel something is deeply wrong in this house, comment, "I see it," because you are right. Something has been wrong in this house for a very long time. Min-ho Kang was the kind of man people lowered their voices for. He had not been born into his position. He had built it the way people who have actually known scarcity build things, carefully, patiently, with a long memory for what it felt like to have nothing and a clear vision of what he needed to protect once he had something. He controlled several businesses across real estate, logistics, and private investment. His name opened doors in rooms that most people never entered. He employed hundreds of people and ran several charitable operations that no article had ever linked to him because he had never needed the credit. The credit was not the point. The point, the only point that had ever truly mattered to him, was his mother. Margaret Kang had raised him after everything fell apart, after the losses and the displacement and the years of nothing but her patience and her discipline and her absolute refusal to let her son believe that what they were enduring was permanent. She had held the household together through things that would have broken most people. She had taught him restraint. She had taught him to enter a room without announcing himself and how to leave one without being forgotten. She had taught him that a man of genuine power did not need to prove it every day. But she had also tried to teach him something he had let slip away as he became more successful, that a man who only ever looks outward will eventually stop seeing what is happening inside his own walls. Margaret Kang was a woman of extraordinary refinement. She kept her posture straight even on ordinary afternoons. She dressed well without ostentation. She had the kind of quiet dignity that comes not from money, but from a life spent maintaining your own standards regardless of circumstance. She cooked on weekends even though the mansion had a full catering staff, because she believed that a person who could still make something with their own hands in their own home had not lost themselves. She had passed that belief on to her son. She had passed on everything she had, which is exactly what had been happening to her, so devastating. Because the greatest cruelty is not the kind that strikes a stranger. It is the kind that is delivered quietly, in a place you thought was yours, by someone you were supposed to be safe with. Then there was Roulette Washington. Roulette had been born between two kinds of strength. Her Black American grandmother had raised her in a household where you did not lower your head to cruelty, not in any form, not for any reason, not because of what it cost you. Her Russian mother had taught her something different but equally important, that silence inside a home is never simply quiet, that silence has a texture, that a house holding something dark feels different from a house that is at peace, even when everything on the surface looks identical. Between those two women, Roulette had learned to read pain before it announced itself. She had worked in hotels and private residences and corporate buildings. She had cleaned up after celebrations and after quiet disasters. She had learned through her own experiences and through watching the lives of people around her that the most dangerous suffering is the kind that no one in the room will name out loud. She had taken the position at the Kang estate because she needed stable work. She had not expected to need anything else from it. But she felt it on the first day, something underneath the immaculate surfaces, something in the way the household staff moved when a certain set of heels clicked down the hallway, something in the way conversations stopped when a particular door opened, something in the way Margaret Kang's hands tightened around her teacup at the sound of particular footsteps approaching from the corridor. Roulette had seen that grip before. She knew exactly what it meant. And then there was Britney Roberts. Brittany was everything a room registered immediately. She was tall, elegant, and in possession of the kind of beauty that got photographed at charitable events and described warmly in social coverage. She had met Minho at a private gathering 3 years prior and had positioned herself in his life with such measured precision that most people around him had not noticed it happening. She said the right things at the right volume. She appeared at events with the right degree of presence. She managed his public image with the instincts of someone who had studied what men like Minho needed from a partner and had decided to become exactly that. What she was not, behind any closed door in that estate, was kind. She had grown up watching women with less than she had end up with everything she wanted. She had decided very early that the way to build a life of real security was to become indispensable to the person who already had it. She was not going to manage her own circumstances the way people with fewer options did. She was going to become the woman of a house like this one. She was going to have the name and the position and the authority that came with it. And nothing was going to stand between her and that outcome. She had already decided which staff would remain once the arrangement was formalized. She had already identified which rooms in the mansion would be repurposed. She had already spoken casually and precisely about the idea of moving Margaret somewhere quieter, somewhere more appropriate for a woman of her stage of life, a private estate, comfortable and well managed, somewhere away from the center of the family. To Brittany, Margaret was not a person she needed to manage around. She was furniture that had overstayed its placement, and Brittany had already begun the process of deciding where to put it. Roulette noticed the pattern before the end of her first week. The first sign was food. Margaret stopped eating when Brittany entered the dining room, not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself. She would simply slow down, set down whatever she was holding, and become very still. the way a person becomes still when they are concentrating very hard on something invisible. Roulette noticed it the second time it happened and started watching for it after that. The second sign was the staff. Whenever Brittany moved toward the private floor, the upper corridor emptied. Not all at once, quietly, one by one, each with a plausible reason to be somewhere else. An inventory task in the south wing, a supply check in the storage rooms below, tasks that could wait, tasks that had been invented, tasks that had the precise function of ensuring that the upper hallway was clear when Brittany arrived. The third sign was Margaret's hands. On 3 separate occasions, Roulette watched Margaret emerge from her sitting room after Brittany had left and move quietly toward the window at the end of the corridor. And each time she held one wrist or pressed a hand against her shoulder in the absent, automatic way of someone touching a place that has recently been hurt. She did not look around to see if anyone was watching. She simply stood there for a moment, composed herself, and walked on. Roulette recorded nothing. She said nothing yet, but she watched everything. She tried once to speak to Margaret gently. She brought a tray to her room on a quiet afternoon, and when she turned to leave, Margaret looked at her with those careful, exhausted eyes and said something that Roulette could not stop thinking about afterward. Margaret said, "Some women survive by staying silent, not because they are weak, because they understand the cost of speaking." Roulette paused at the door. She said, "I understand that. I grew up around women who understood it too, but I also watched what silence does over time. It holds you up for a while, and then one day it becomes the weight that pulls you under." Margaret did not answer, but she did not look away either. Then came the dinner. Brittany had arranged a meal in the formal dining room, something she did occasionally to maintain the appearance of family harmony. The staff moved around the table, and Roulette stayed close enough to observe. Margaret sat at one end, composed as always, and Brittany sat beside Min-ho at the other. For most of the meal, everything was surface level and controlled. Then Margaret made a small comment about a dish she'd used to prepare years ago, something from memory, something warm and personal. And Brittany looked across the table with a soft smile and said, "We have a full catering staff now, Mother. You do not need to worry about that anymore." The smile did not reach her eyes. Then she leaned forward very slightly, adjusted the edge of Margaret's sleeve with 2 fingers, and whispered, "Careful, you are embarrassing him again."
Margaret lowered her eyes. Roulette saw it from across the room. She stood very still and kept her expression exactly neutral. That was when she understood that what was happening in that house was not occasional. It was managed. It was deliberate. Brittany had not slipped. That small moment had been calculated down to the volume of the whisper and the angle of the smile. And no one at that table, including Minho, had seen it happen. That was when Roulette understood that everyone already knew, and that knowing had not been enough for any of them to act. That was the cruelest truth in the mansion. Not that cruelty was happening, but that an entire household of people had watched it happen and decided that the cost of speaking was higher than the cost of Margaret's suffering.
There is something that needs to be said about why Margaret stayed silent, because it was not weakness, and it deserves to be understood. Years before Roulette arrived, when Minho was still in the earlier stages of building what his businesses would become, Margaret had made a decision. It was not a perfect decision. It was the kind that a person makes when every available option is insufficient, and they must choose the one that protects the person they love most, even at personal cost. It involved a private arrangement in the business world, nothing that harmed anyone directly, but the kind of thing that, taken out of context and handed to the right person at the right moment, could become a damaging story, could become something that complicated the reputation Minho had spent years constructing. Brittany had found it. She had not found it by accident. She had spent time, deliberate and patient time understanding the architecture of the Kang family before she fully committed herself to positioning herself inside it. And when she found what she was looking for, she did not confront Margaret with it loudly. She did not threaten her in any way that could later be described as a threat. She simply let Margaret know that she was aware. She let her understand what the information was worth in the wrong hands, and then she told her, with the calm of someone explaining an arrangement, that the condition of the information staying quiet was her continued cooperation. Her silence for Margaret's silence. She said it once, clearly, and then she never had to say it again. Because Margaret understood. She understood that Brittany was not simply cruel, she was calculated. She had built a structure around herself that made speaking dangerous, not for Brittany, but for the person who chose to speak. Margaret had looked at the situation from every angle she could see and arrived at the same conclusion every time. If she said anything, the story would find its way out, and Minho, the man she had sacrificed everything to protect, would be damaged by the very act of his mother trying to protect herself. So she had stayed quiet, not because she had stopped hoping, but because she had decided that her suffering was a cost she was willing to pay to protect her son. What she had not counted on was that Brittany's behavior would escalate, that what had begun as control and humiliation would eventually become something more physical, that the woman who entered this house through calculation would over time become less controlled in her cruelty the more secure she felt in her position. And no one had been watching, until Roulette.
One evening, Roulette heard something she was not meant to hear. Brittany had gone to Margaret's room late, after most of the staff had settled for the night, and she spoke to her in a low voice about the upcoming changes to the household. She said that once the formal arrangements were completed, Margaret's current room would be redesigned for another purpose. She said that the private garden room Margaret used on mornings would be repurposed for entertaining. She said all of this quietly and without anger, the way someone reads a list of items they have already checked off. And then she told Margaret that the greatest gift she could give her son was to stop making her presence a complication in his future. Roulette, standing near the corridor, felt something harden in her chest. She made a decision that night. The next time Brittany walked toward that room with the intention of making Margaret smaller, Roulette was not going to be in the hallway.
It happened on a Thursday afternoon. Minho had left early that morning for a series of meetings that his personal assistant had confirmed would run through the afternoon. The household had settled into its usual rhythms. Roulette moved through her tasks with her customary calm, but she was paying attention to everything. She noticed when Brittany quietly redirected two of the downstairs staff to handle tasks in the south wing. She noticed the particular quiet that settled over the upper corridor afterward. She noticed when Brittany's footsteps began moving toward the private floor with the even, unhurried pace of someone who felt entirely untouchable in this space. Roulette set down what she was holding. She walked to the sitting room and positioned herself just inside the door where a folded throw had been left on the side table that genuinely needed storing. She was not hiding, she was present. In a home like this one, a member of staff in any given room was ordinary, nearly invisible, which was exactly what Roulette had understood about her position from the beginning. Brittany entered without looking at her. She walked toward Margaret, who sat near the window in her usual chair, with her posture still straight and her hands folded in her lap, and the particular stillness of someone who has learned to take up as little space as possible. Brittany began speaking to Margaret, in a low, measured tone Roulette had come to recognize, the kind that sounds like a conversation but functions like a verdict. But today, something in Brittany's composure had shifted. She was angrier than usual. The previous evening, Minho had spent time with his mother. Nothing dramatic, just a son checking in, briefly, in the way he rarely did anymore. But Brittany had noticed. She had watched it from the doorway and understood what it meant. Margaret was reaching him, not through accusations or complaints, simply through being present in his space, through reminding him, by proximity, that he existed in this house and that he had once known how to pay attention to her. And Brittany could not let that continue. She told Margaret this, quietly at first, and then with the hard, controlled edge that comes when someone who has been performing composure for a very long time allows a portion of the performance to slip. She accused Margaret of working against her, of saying things to Minho designed to complicate their relationship. She said this with enough conviction that it would have been difficult to argue with if Margaret was the type to argue, which she was not. Then Brittany reached forward and gripped Margaret's shoulder. Margaret did not make a sound. Roulette was already moving. She crossed the room in 4 steps and caught Brittany's raised wrist in midair, not roughly, but without hesitation, with the full weight of a decision that had already been made. The grip said, "This is where it ends." The room went silent. Brittany turned to look at her, and in those first 2 seconds, before she reassembled herself, the expression on her face was unguarded. It was not anger, it was disbelief. Because in everything she had engineered inside this house, across all the time she had spent constructing the conditions that allowed her to operate without consequence, not one person had ever physically interrupted her. Roulette looked at her and said, "Not again." Margaret was trembling, the kind of trembling that comes when a body has been holding tension for a very long time and something in the room has suddenly released a portion of it without warning. Then the doors opened. Min-ho walked in. He had come back early. His meetings had ended ahead of schedule. He had not called ahead. He simply came home, the way a man who owns a space does not always announce his arrival in it. He stepped through the doors and stopped. He saw Roulette holding Brittany's wrist in the air. He saw his mother trembling by the window. He saw everything in the room that needed to be seen. Brittany moved first. She pulled her wrist back, and her face changed in the space of a breath, from its unguarded state back into something composed and softened and already preparing to explain. She said, "Minho, she grabbed me because I caught her going through your mother's private belongings. She was standing over her when I came in. I do not know what she said to her, but look at your mother. Look at how frightened she is." It was a perfect lie, specific enough to be plausible, delivered in a voice that was beginning to tremble with something that looked like distress. The air shifted. Even Roulette felt it. Minho looked at Roulette. Then he looked at his mother. And then he crossed the room and he crouched beside his mother's chair so that his face was level with hers. He did not look at Brittany. He did not look at anyone else. He looked only at his mother, and he said one question so quietly that only she could fully hear it. He said, "How long?" Margaret looked at him. Her eyes filled, and then one tear moved down the side of her face, slow and precise, the kind of tear that has been held back for so long that when it finally comes, it carries everything with it. And then she spoke. She said, "Long enough that I stopped hoping it would end and started hoping you would never find out." Minho's face went completely still. He stood up. He turned and looked at Brittany. Then he turned and looked at Roulette, and he said, in a voice with no volume and no heat and nothing wasted in it at all, "No one leaves this room until I understand everything." If you are still watching, comment, "I am still here," because what Roulette reveals next changes everything.
What happened in that room for the next hour was not a confrontation in any dramatic sense. It was something quieter and far more permanent. Brittany tried to maintain control of the narrative. She was very good at it. She said that Margaret had been experiencing confusion lately. She said that Roulette was new and had inserted herself into a private family moment in a way that was inappropriate for someone in her position. She said that she herself was shaken by what had just occurred and needed Min-ho to understand how much invisible effort went into managing the household in his absence. She framed everything around herself, around her patience, around how long she had been managing a difficult domestic situation that Min-ho had been too occupied to notice. She was fluent in this language. She had been speaking inside this house for a long time. But Min-ho was not watching Brittany while she spoke. He was watching Roulette. And Roulette was not performing. She was not crying or appealing to him or positioning herself as anything other than what she was. She stood where she had been standing and told him in plain and specific language what she had observed over 5 days. She did not reach for drama. She told him about the pattern she had noticed, the way the staff cleared the upper corridor whenever Brittany approached, the nature of the conversations she had heard through the door on the private floor, the 3 times she had seen Margaret touching her wrist or her shoulder after Brittany had left, the dinner where Brittany had leaned across the table and whispered something that made Margaret lower her eyes. She told him about the footsteps. She told him about the grip on Margaret's shoulder. She told him everything she had seen. And then she said, "I did not come into this house looking for this. I came to do a job, but I know what pain looks like when a person is managing it alone. And your mother has been managing something alone that she should never have had to carry by herself." Min-ho said nothing for a moment. Then he looked at Jocelyn, the senior housekeeper who had been standing near the doorway since the beginning of all this, trembling slightly, with the expression of someone who has been standing at the edge of a decision for too long. Jocelyn stepped into the room. She said she had worked in the estate for 12 years. And then she began to speak. What she said next was not what anyone expected. She told Min-ho that Margaret had tried to reach him once, several months earlier. Margaret had asked to arrange a private dinner with her son, just the 2 of them, nothing dramatic. She had wanted to speak to him alone. But Brittany had found out before the arrangement was confirmed. She had gone to Margaret first and told her that she would not allow Min-ho to be burdened with household management concerns, and that Margaret was confused about what constituted a family matter and what was simply the adjustment period of a new domestic arrangement.
Then Brittany had gone to Minho and casually mentioned that his mother had been acting slightly out of sorts lately, perhaps needing more rest, perhaps finding the social demands of the household more tiring than she was letting on. Minho had heard it as concern. He had told his assistant to ensure his mother had quieter afternoons. He had believed entirely that he was helping her. After that, Margaret had stopped trying. Another housekeeper came to the doorway, then another, one at a time, quietly, each contributing a piece of the picture that had been assembled over the years inside those walls. Not accusations built for performance, just plain accounts of what each of them had seen and stayed silent about for the sake of their own stability, for the sake of a calculation that every one of them had made and would carry with them long after that day. What Roulette had done by standing still in that room had changed the air. It had made speaking feel survivable. Minho listened to all of it. And then he sat with the thing that was truly devastating him, which was not anger at Brittany, though that was present. It was the understanding of his own failure. He knew the names of men who owed him significant amounts across multiple industries. He had not known the sound of his mother holding back tears in the next room. He had not known because he had stopped listening for it. He had trusted the surface of his household because the surface had always been so carefully arranged.
and he had let that surface become a wall between himself and the truth of what was happening behind it. His mother had not suffered because he lacked power. She had suffered because he had stopped paying attention. That understanding sat in him with a weight that nothing else in that room could match. And then Brittany said something that shifted everything again. She looked at him with a composure that had cracked only slightly and said, "You think your mother is innocent in all of this? Before you decide what happened here, ask her what she has been hiding from you." The room went quiet in a different way. And then Margaret said the sentence that made Minho's face go completely still.
Margaret looked at her son, and she told him everything. She told him about the arrangement from years ago. She told him about what Brittany had found and how she had used it, not loudly, not as a formal threat, but as a shape held in the air between them, always present, never needing to be spoken again after the first time. She told her that the condition of that information staying quiet was her own silence, her stillness, her cooperation with the gradual process of being removed from the center of the household she had lived in and loved and tried to maintain with everything she had. She told him she had accepted it because she had decided that what Brittany could do to his name mattered more than what Brittany was doing to her body. She said, "I was not afraid of her hand. I was afraid of what she knew. And I was afraid that if you found out about the choice I made, you would look at me differently. I could endure what she did. I could not endure losing you." Minho was very still. He said, "You were protecting me." Margaret said, "I have always been protecting you. That is not something that stops." He was quiet for a long time after that. Then he turned to Brittany. Not with the look of a man preparing for a confrontation, with the look of a man who has simply computed something and arrived at a conclusion that requires no further deliberation. He said, "You used the love my mother had for me as a mechanism to keep her suffering." Brittany looked at him. He said, "You knew exactly what you were doing." She did not deny it. She had run out of the posture that denial required. What came out of her instead was the thing that had always been underneath the performance. She looked at Margaret with an expression that held no grace in it at all. She said everything she had been managing behind composure for 3 years. She said that Margaret was the obstacle between her and the life she had worked to build. She said that the arrangement of the household she had planned was reasonable and that Margaret was not being asked to disappear, only to be practical about the realities of a new phase. She said that Roulette was a woman who had been in the house for 5 days and had no right to be standing in this room with the expression she was carrying.
And then she looked at Minho and said, "You think he is going to choose a maid over everything we have built?" The room waited. Minho reached forward and removed the ring from Brittany's hand. He said, "You were never going to be the woman of this house." Brittany had one final insult left. She looked at Roulette with everything the mask had been holding and said it without words, in the specific way that certain women communicate contempt, clearly and completely, and without the possibility of misunderstanding. Roulette looked back at her without expression. She did not need to say anything. Minho did not look at Roulette like a man looking at a woman he wanted, not in that moment. He looked at her the way a man looks at the first honest person who has walked through his doors in a very long time, with a kind of recognition that has nothing to do with desire and everything to do with seeing someone clearly and understanding what their presence has cost them. That was something else entirely, and it was the beginning of something neither of them would name for a long time yet.
Britney Roberts left the Kang estate that same afternoon. Not in spectacle,
Minho told her the arrangement was over in the same measured tone he used her all serious things, and the household security staff were present when she collected what was hers and walked through the front entrance for the last time. The door closed. The house exhaled in the way that houses do when something that had been pressing on them is finally removed. Minho spent the following days doing something he had not done in a long time. He was home. Not in the way of a man who simply occupies a space, he was present in it. He sat with his mother in the sitting room with the bay window. He had meals with her. He asked her questions, not about the household or the logistics of the estate, but about what she had been reading, what she had been thinking, how she was moving through her days. He listened to her answers the way he had listened to her when she was the most important teacher available to him in any room he entered. He moved her into the brightest room in the mansion, not tucked away in a private wing managed at a distance by rotating staff, at the center of the house, because that was where she belonged, because that was where she had always belonged. He let go of the staff members who had remained closest to Brittany's arrangements and stayed silent past the point where silence was acceptable. He kept the ones who had spoken. He gave Jocelyn a formal acknowledgement and a significant increase to her compensation, not as a transaction, but as a recognition of what it had cost her to finally step into the room. And then he asked Roulette to stay, as head of the household staff. Roulette was quiet for a moment. Then she told him that she had not stepped into that sitting room because she wanted a better position. She had done it because she could not have lived with herself otherwise. She said the cleanest way she could describe it was that she had not been raised to walk past a person in pain when her hands were free and her feet were steady. Minho said, "I know that. That is exactly why I'm asking." One afternoon in the garden room, where the afternoon light was soft and the house was quieter than it had been in years, Margaret took Roulette's hand. She held it for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "You came into this home as staff, but the thing you did for me cannot be filed away in a category. You gave me back my voice, and I will not forget that for whatever time I have left." Roulette stayed, not for the title, not for the recognition. Because of Margaret's face in that moment, because of what it meant to watch a woman who had survived alone for so long finally be seen by someone who was not going to look away. There was a night some weeks later when Minho was walking the upper corridor late and came upon Roulette standing at the window that overlooked the grounds. They stood there for a while without speaking. The house was very still. He thanked her. She told him not to thank her. She told him just never to ignore the silence again. He looked at her, and he said, "I am working on that every day." What grew between them after that was slow and careful, and built entirely on something real. It did not announce itself. It did not follow any familiar shape. It was built on the specific kind of respect that only comes from having seen what a person is capable of when everything is at stake and the easiest option was to look the other way. It was built on truth, and truth is the only foundation that does not eventually give way.
There is a question underneath all of this that deserves to be held. How many homes like the Kang estate exist right now? How many women like Margaret are in rooms where they have calculated the cost of speaking and decided the calculation does not come out in their favor? How many people like the staff in that house have seen something wrong and told themselves that it was not their place? How many people like Brittany have been allowed to operate in private year after year because the person with authority to stop it was looking everywhere except the right place? Minho knew the names of men across multiple industries who owed him obligations. He had built a life around precision and awareness, and he had not known the sound of his own mother holding back tears through the wall of the next room. He had not known because he had built the kind of distance that success can build, slowly, without intention, until one day the people closest to you are further away than they have ever been, and you have not noticed the movement. He was not a monster. He was a man who had stopped paying attention to the right things. That is both an ordinary story and a frightening one. The staff in that house were not cowardly people. They were people with families and obligations and a clear-eyed understanding of what they could afford to risk. They had made the calculation that most people make when the cost of speaking falls on themselves and the cost of silence falls on someone else. That is human, and it is one of the most dangerous things about the way cruelty sustains itself in private spaces. What Roulette did was not impossible. It was not superhuman. She stood where she was. She did not move back. She held on. And that single act gave everyone else in that house permission to do something they had already wanted to do and had been afraid to. Sometimes that is all it takes, not a grand intervention, just one person deciding that they are not going to look away today, and then standing still enough for everyone else to gather behind them. Think about the last time you saw something you chose not to say anything about. Think about what it cost the other person. Think about what it cost you. And ask yourself honestly, what would you have done if you were standing in that room? If you were Roulette in your first week with everything to lose and no guarantee that anyone would stand with you, would you have moved? If you were Jocelyn with 12 years of security and a family to protect, would you have spoken sooner? If you were Minho, would you have been paying closer attention? And if you were Margaret, would you have trusted someone with the truth before it became something you could barely carry? Let us know in the comments. Tell us which person in this story stayed with you longest. Tell us what it made you think about in your own life. We read every comment, and your answer to those questions matters more than you might think.
Months after that Thursday, the Kang estate was a different kind of place. The chandeliers were still there, the dark wood and the heavy furniture and the particular hush of a very large home were all unchanged. But the quality of what lived inside it had shifted in a way that anyone who visited could feel without being able to name precisely. It was not the decor, it was not anything visible, it was the fact that the house had stopped holding its breath. Margaret sat in the garden room most mornings with sunlight on her hands, reading or writing, or simply sitting without the particular tensed stillness that had defined her posture for so long. She had taken up correspondence with people she had let fall out of touch. She had started quietly and deliberately to tell her story, not publicly, not for attention, but in the specific way of a woman who has been given her voice back and understands the responsibility of using it. Roulette managed the household with the same calm and directness she had carried from the first day. The staff respected her in the way that comes not from authority, but from character. When people asked her about what happened in the sitting room that Thursday, she said only that she had done what anyone should have done, which was not entirely accurate, but which was what she genuinely believed, and that belief was part of what made her who she was. Min-ho came home for dinner. Not every night. His life was still what it was, but far more consistently than before. And when he came home present. He entered rooms instead of passing through them. He asked questions instead of accepting the surface of things as the whole picture. One evening he paused at the doorway of the garden room. Margaret was in her chair near the window. Roulette was giving quiet instructions to two of the household staff nearby. The light was late and golden and coming through the tall panes at an angle that made the room look like something painted rather than lived in. He stood there for a moment. Then he walked in. He sat beside his mother. He put his hand over hers on the armrest. And for the first time in a very long time, the house did not feel expensive. It felt safe. That is the thing about safety.
It is not built from marble floors or security systems or having the right name above the door. It is built from the daily, unglamorous work of paying attention to the people inside your walls, of asking the real questions, of staying in the room long enough to hear the real answers. One brave hand stopped years of suffering. But what prevents that kind of suffering from beginning in the first place is not bravery. It is simply attention.
It is the choice, made daily, to look at the people you love and ask not just how they are managing, but how they are. This story is finished. The question it leaves behind is yours. What would you have done? If this story moved something in you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. You never know who in your life is sitting quietly in a room somewhere, managing something alone that they were never meant to carry alone. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for a person is simply to let them know that you see them. Subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. We will see you in the next one.